The following is a sports scene specialty show. Here is your host, Greg Bicouvaris.
And welcome here to Sports Scene Specialty Show. This show topic is the rise and fall of Georgetown basketball. We're doing this because it's March Madness, and Georgetown over the years has had a great history. My name is Greg Bicouvaris, Greg Bick on YouTube, gjbtv.com, and you can find me on LinkedIn and Facebook. Thanks to our sponsors, Dino, and our great guest as well. This should be a fun half hour. Paul Fuqua is our featured guest. Paul, how are you?
Fine, thank you. Thank you for having me on again.
Very good. Paul and I go back a long ways. He has been a guest of mine on Sports Highlights and Sports Scene in the past as well. And, of course, he was an assistant basketball coach at American University. And, of course, he's a Georgetown alum. So he's very equipped to talk about this topic. Paul, first of all, let's go into the Hoyas head coaches briefly since Big John. Of course, we talk about the days of John McGee and Tommy O'Keefe. Then, of course, Thompson won a national championship. Then Craig Esherick, JT3, and, of course, Patrick Ewing. But Big John, of course, set the legacy himself.
Yes, he did. He took over that program, I think it was from O'Keefe, in 1972, and that's when I met him. His children attended grade school with my children, and I ended up being both of his boys' coaches in grade school and then subsequently in high school.
Very nice. And you talk about that, too, as well, that he had a great legacy there with some of his players like Sleepy Floyd and Patrick Ewing, of course, who's the head coach now, Allen Iverson, Wingate, Reggie Williams. But you look at it, in 1982, he played against his good friend Dean Smith in North Carolina and Michael Jordan, and they lost to Carolina, but they got revenge 2 years later, and they won the national championship.
Yes. Well, you don't want to forget the fact that John Thompson also brought into his program the likes of Craig Shelton and John Bebe Duran, both of whom were highly recruited nationally, and both were the first true blue chippers to attend Georgetown. And John Duran was on the floor when they defeated Syracuse in the last game at Manley Fieldhouse, and John Thompson was able to say, Manley Fieldhouse is now closed.
Absolutely. And, of course, you talk about where Georgetown's played. I remember in 2014, I had a chance to work against West Virginia in the NIT at McDonough, and you can still see Big John up there from the top rafters watching his team. And it's a great honor. They named that court and also the court they play most of their home games after him.
Well, John Thompson had left an indelible mark on college basketball, not just Georgetown University, because he was a proponent of bringing as many people of color into the game from a managerial and coaching position as possible. And you look in the Big East now, of the entire league, I think there are 7 head coaches who are people who are black. Which is fairly it flies in the face of many of the other conferences.
So actually, Tommy O'Keefe was the coach. Then John Jack McGee, and Thompson replaced Jack McGee. But it was the Hoya paranoia of the 80s that was really what caught my attention. I worked some games in the Capitol Center. I remember I spent a long time talking to Jim Boeheim before the game when he was very accessible back then. And,
right.
But you talk about such great rivalries they had with Louis Carnesecca and St. John's, and, of course, Rolly Massimino and Villanova, and the list goes on and on.
All those guys were city guys. Massimino and that the whole crowd that was coaching in the Big East came out of the city game, and that's what made the Big East so popular when it burst onto the scene almost uninvited. But remember, they were smart in that they captured the cable market going into the cities, and that made the huge difference.
This is a specialty show on Sports Scene. We're talking, it's March Madness here, and we're talking Georgetown, the rise and fall of this great program. And, of course, 2 players from Hampton Roads played for the Hoyas. And, of course, we mentioned his name earlier, Allen Iverson, who went to Bethel High School. And, of course, somebody you know very well, Alonzo Mourning.
Yes, Alonzo. In fact, I brought my high school team down here from Mackin Catholic High School in D.C. to play Alonzo his senior year at Indian River. It was a standing room only crowd. I still can't stand to watch the last 4 minutes of that game into the overtime because of the officiating. It makes my bile rise. It was so bad.
Yeah, that's what the show's supposed to do, of course.
That was awful.
Yeah, I mean, and the good thing is, too, and we got Dino here producing, too, as well. It's a pleasure to be on 100.9 FM and 1310 AM, all powered by Fox Sports, is that a lot of these memorable games are on YouTube. And you can go back and watch some of these games or the highlights, too. And just everything was consistent with John. The uniforms, his structure, his organization. Any successful person in business or sports is organized, and that's the first thing I think of Coach Thompson.
Coach Thompson held people accountable. When the Urban Coalition Summer League couldn't account for where the money went, John started the Kenner Foundation and the Kenner League, housed at McDonough. Big Head Fred, one of his former managers, was ostensibly in charge, and then I got a call from the coach and said, can you come over and help? And I ended up being on the board and creating the foundation, and we made that thing happen. But it was to be in direct competition with the Urban Coalition in D.C.
This is Sports Scene at Greg Bick on Twitter and YouTube. It's GREGBIC here with Paul Fuqua, Dino producing. It's a pleasure right here to talk about this topic. Of course, we'll get more into college basketball in the second part of this show. This is a 30-minute program as well. And you talk about, just the rise and fall. I mean, it really is. I mean, Thompson brought him to new heights. It's not that big of a school. He put him on the map. And you know the DMV very well. He was competing against Lefty and other schools back then when Lefty had some great teams in the 70s and the 80s. And, of course, he always had his advisor, his academic advisor, on the bench.
Mary Fenlon.
And she's since passed away.
Yes, Mary Fenlon held the players accountable. Freshman year, they had to call her every night before midnight and report on the progress of their class work. That's one of the reasons why you got the Hoya paranoia going, because they did not allow freshmen to be interviewed until they reached a certain point in the year, and that caused great consternation with the press. Big John was a remarkable man, and he has left a legacy, and he created opportunities for many, many, many people. One of the things he was most proud of was the number of jobs he created that were able to be filled by D.C. residents and black guys and young white guys and people that were within his sphere. I always found him to be a great person for conversation, but he could also be very abrupt.
Right. And, of course, I remember he said one thing he did a radio show as well. And up in D.C., he said, I know two languages. I know English and I know cursing. So
he could let it go, boy, I'll tell you.
Yeah, he was always very pleasant. In fact, one of the last times I saw him working a game, I mentioned your name as well to him. And, of course, you go back with his family a long way. I've worked with his son on some TV games, too. So the Thompson name has got a big legacy. Georgetown's got a big name. It's a matter of them getting back to where they need to be in the college basketball world. But we mentioned the recruiting, and you look at some of the players from that area like Derek Wittenberg, Sidney Lowe. I remember Adrian Dantley. You know, there were some great players in that area, but not all of them went to Georgetown.
Those were all DeMatha players. And DeMatha and John were at odds largely because of Morgan Wooten, who had applied for the job at Georgetown when it was open. And he withdrew his application when John Thompson's name began to be bandied about. And that set up this competition that was really one-sided from the standpoint of where the DeMatha players were going to go. I think the first DeMatha player that ever attended Georgetown was Austin Freeman, who was recruited by John Thompson III, and that broke the ice.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about such great high school basketball there. I went to George Mason, and we had players from D.C. that went to my school, and Earl Moore, who went, and also McKinley Tech was Kenny Sanders. He went there. Great players. In fact, Kenny transferred from Oklahoma to George Mason. Now, Paul, it seems like the NIL, everybody's transferring.
I think the NIL and the portal are going to create it's already created total chaos in collegiate sports, but especially in basketball.
Very nice. Talking to Paul Fuqua, at Greg Bick on Twitter, at Greg Bick on YouTube, of course, and here with Dino, who's been a wonderful producer and host for several decades here on the radio as well, making this all happen for us. And the final few moments before we go to break in our first part of the show is the future of college basketball. With that portal, with the NIL, it's I remember my dad told me something a long time ago that these players are really already getting paid by getting full scholarships. Most kids go in debt, paying credit card debts forever, trying to pay their school off. But whatever happened to that?
Well, I think that the money that is being paid to the NCAA is so significant as an entertainment expenditure that it's somewhat fair to spread those dollars across the population that's creating them. I'm a firm believer, and I know Coach Thompson was a firm believer in that aspect. However, the idea of that money now being able to, it's supposedly you're not able to entice recruits to the school and making promises of NIL money. But let's face it, we're human beings, and everybody involved in this process is a human being, and the element of greed arises fairly quickly to the top when you're talking about incoming freshmen having monies in the neighborhood of $700,000 and be above in order to play a sport. And that money is, in essence, guaranteed. And the transfers are so available through the portal so that you could conceivably be at DePaul and transfer out to some other university because the NIL deal is going to be so much better there. Look at the SEC. Chris Finwood, coach here at Old Dominion, remarked recently that Vanderbilt has $750,000 in its kitty for NIL to baseball players, which is not a revenue sport.
Yeah, that's something else. Well, the big schools can control the narrative, but it's all controlled really by football. They're the moneymaker, and then it goes down to basketball. It trickles down to all the different Olympic sports as well. We have a lot more to talk about in the second half. This is Sports Scene, a specialty show right here on Georgetown basketball and college basketball, the rise and fall of Georgetown basketball. Stay tuned for our next segment.
The Sports Scene Specialty Show is brought to you in part by CP Shuckers, Eat or Be Eaten, Linda Matney Gallery, where art comes alive in Williamsburg, Oh Yummy Sushi, with 2 locations in Virginia Beach, and by Sakura Restaurant, located in Chesapeake.
Sakura Japanese Restaurant in Chesapeake is your destination for excellent Japanese food, featuring fresh sushi and hot dishes prepared in the kitchen for lunch and dinner. Sakura is located at 1437 Sam's Drive at the Walmart Way Crossing. Oh Yummy Sushi is at the Renaissance Place at 401 North Great Neck Road in Virginia Beach. Both Sakura in Chesapeake and Oh Yummy Sushi in Virginia Beach are available with DoorDash, Uber Eats, Grubhub, and Pickup. Tasty Japanese food the way you want it is at Sakura and Oh Yummy Sushi.
Oh Yummy Sushi Japanese Restaurant in Kemps River is open and ready to serve you, featuring an all-you-can-eat experience with signature dishes from the kitchen and fresh sushi prepared for you. Oh Yummy Sushi is open for lunch and dinner daily with dine-in, carry-out, as well as DoorDash, Uber Eats, and Grubhub. Located at 1255 Fordham Drive at the Kemps River Crossing. Call 937-2011 for Oh Yummy Sushi, the best sushi in Hampton Roads.
Now, back to the Sports Scene Special. Here is Greg and Paul.
And welcome back to Sports Scene, our specialty show on Georgetown basketball, the rise and fall of this great program. You can also watch sports highlights on YouTube as well. Talking to Paul Fuqua, our featured guest here, along with Dino, Greg Bicouvaris. Glad you're with us right here on 1310 and 100.9 FM as well. Paul, you're an assistant at American University with Ed Tapscott. Talk about your experience there and also going against your alma mater as well.
One of the great thrills of my life was being on the same floor as the Georgetown team. We played them at the Cap Center, and that was the era of Patrick Ewing and Michael Jackson and all those great players in that time. And we played them 2 years in a row while I was there. Then I left, and surprisingly enough, the next year, Eddie Tapscott and AU knocked off Georgetown, which was an accomplishment. And I think he was wired and monitored. His heartbeat was monitored, if I'm not mistaken. Eddie Tapscott was, and it went up to like 180 during crucial times of the game. But that gave me an opportunity to have the college experience, the college coaching experience that allowed me to take over Mackin Catholic High School when the job opened up.
We'll talk about some of the highlights and the players that stood out in your time.
In my time, we've got to go back. John Duran and Craig Shelton were key. The element of the kids that came in there after Bebe and Craig, Big Sky, moved on, they were very good players, but they weren't impact players until Patrick Ewing showed up. And that's when you knew that there would be an opportunity for Georgetown to compete in the Final Four and for a national championship. John Thompson knew it the day he signed, or the day he got the commitment out of Patrick Ewing. But during that whole period, there were players that were recruited out of Louisiana and recruited out of the DMV and recruited out, especially out of Baltimore, Dunbar, Baltimore, and the DC schools. The list is, I don't want to say it's endless, but there are so many players. We know that Mourning and Iverson out of this area, but out of the D.C. area, Mark Tillman, Victor Page, who had a short career but was one of the finest, most skilled, most talented basketball player I ever had opportunity to coach. Coached him representing D.C. in the Sharon Lions tournament, Sharon, Ohio. He recruited Ronnie Highsmith and Mike Riley. He recruited out of the Army or Navy. Was a St. Anthony's kid. Remember, he brought kids out of St. Anthony's when he took over the Georgetown program, and that was key. And that's one of the reasons why there was this conflict between Georgetown and DeMatha, because when St. Anthony's, under the coaching leadership of John Thompson, applied for entrance into the Metro Conference, the Catholic League, he was turned down. The school was turned down by Morgan Wooten and Joe Gallagher, St. John's and DeMatha High School. All the other schools said, fine, St. Anthony's can bring talent into our program.
Very nice. And, of course, we mentioned McGee and O'Keefe, back in the early days of Georgetown, but in my lifetime it was, and of course those two guys were part of it, John Thompson, of course, Craig Esherick, JT3, Patrick Ewing. How was the dynamic of John and his son coaching? Because there were good times where the younger Thompson did very well in the NCAA tournament, but as I saw a lot of his games, and I would see Thompson agonizing as his son's teams were losing. That was not an easy sight to see in John's last few years.
It wasn't an easy sight to see during the Esherick rule, because remember, Craig Esherick was a long time player and assistant to John Thompson. He was one of his key recruiters, and he helped structure the program throughout all those years of success. So he suffered seeing his protege, Craig Esherick, not be as successful as he thought he could be. And then that kind of loss of the gloss of the program that occurred under Craig. And then subsequently towards the later years in JT3's reign as coach, the gloss fell off. And I know it caused John Thompson to suffer. And that adjustment was difficult because how do you hold your protege and or your son accountable for things that you know they can't control? Because the circumstances of college basketball were changing during that time.
And a lot of that goes, too, in the Big East. You talk about back then Boeheim, Massimino, Carnesecca. You got to remember, all those that have power are afraid to lose it. And I'm a huge Syracuse fan, and I went to George Mason. But right now what's going on with Boeheim is just that. He's afraid to lose that power, afraid to give it to some of his assistants. Who knows? He's got a winning record this year, and he'll probably make the NIT unless they win the ACC tournament. That'll be doubtful, but who knows? All right, let's get right here to the good stuff. Patrick Ewing won a national championship in 1984. He lost to Villanova the final year, his senior in 1985. He did make the NCAA tournament and won the Big East tournament a couple years ago. He has had 2 500 seasons, 3 losing seasons, including this year, and 1 winning season. What has gone wrong the last 2 years? Because I'll say this is the worst performance. Even you said it. Your American University beat Georgetown this year as well.
Yes.
What has gone wrong, Paul?
I think one of the key elements that isn't talked about is the loss of Louis Orr, who was Patrick Ewing's confidant. He was a very experienced coach. I don't know how many years he spent at Syracuse. They were comfortable. And with his demise, and it took 2 years, and it removed him from the program, there was, and I'm not party to all the dynamics within the coaching. This is all from observation. I tape every game. I go to the games as regularly as I can. And I think that the loss of Louis Orr really impacted Patrick Ewing. And good coaches create coaching trees. And I don't know that he was able to build them over the 6 years. I mean, he relied upon a tight-knit group, and that tight-knit group was in part structured around his relationship with Louis Orr. This is what I see, and that's from afar. And that's what I think has created the chaos that you see on the court, in that you don't have continuity in your coaching staff. You certainly do not have continuity in the Georgetown program with the loss of so many players for a variety of reasons, most of which don't lay in the lap of the head coach. How does a head coach deal with kids that misbehave in their first year and then subsequently have to go on to get great talents too?
But that happens at all schools. There's attrition at every school. But the sad part about Ewing is, for 3 out of his 4 years, 83, NC State won the national championship. But like I said, his first year, they lost to Carolina. His junior year, they won the national championship. His senior year, they lost to Rowley and Villanova. But back when John was coaching, Big John, there was no Facebook to amount to anything or social media. Ewing, their most decorated big-name player, former New York Knick, is getting butchered on social media. The attendance sometimes is crickets. Old Dominion draws better some nights than and Old Dominion has played Georgetown in the last several years as well. That's the sad part. When sponsors go away, when alumni goes away, when donors go away, when big money goes away, when fans go away, when TV goes away. I mean, for example, Fox, now I've worked for them as a stage manager, has only done 1 home game this year. Now, they did some road games. It's affecting everything.
Yes, it is. Losing is a cancer. I've been at that end of it. 1 year, I lost an All-American point guard, and I'd built a team around him. It was a shame, but it happened. And we had 1 loss in our record, and we were 7-1. And the only loss we had was to Alonzo. And then I had to pull his uniform, and unfortunately, I had made the mistake of building a program around him, and we ended up going 8-20. The administration at that high school, though, backed me. So I have an allegiance to those folks who said, you did right. You did right. And the interesting thing was, after I did that, I had an influx of players whose parents brought them because they saw the discipline that we had in the program. But that's 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I mean, that's the past. And what John Thompson did probably could not be done today. Turn a program around so quickly and so effectively, and be competing within how many years was it from the time he took over? It was 12 years, and he played for the national championship for the second time. And he went through a series of players who were good, who ended up playing in the pros, but they didn't have that magic that Patrick Ewing and that group had.
Yeah, even though Iverson played the 90s, his team in the 80s were a lot better than his teams in the 90s.
Yes.
And he was frustrated. He was going through some personal issues. You and I have talked about it. He walked off the court and he was done, kind of like Lefty did when he coached at Georgia State. He had coached at Davidson, then Maryland, then James Madison, and of course he coached at Georgia State. He just said, you know what, I'm in my 70s, I'm done. Thompson was not that old, but he was done. And he cherished the role to see his son and Esherick for a while, but they named a building after him.
Yes, well, they built that whole facility, not just a build. That facility was badly needed. But what the university has not done, it has never replaced McDonough. It has Yates Fieldhouse, but it does not have a Coliseum that could seat 8,000, which would be spectacular. I mean, you look at Cameron at Duke, and you look at not Hinkle, but some of the other, and not Syracuse, but like Villanova's facility. I think it seats 7,500, and it's on campus.
Yeah.
You realize those kids on campus have to get on a bus or take the subway and go down into downtown, and it's a chore. And it's not something that prompts students to take time off in the evenings, especially weekdays, to go to a game.
All right, this is Sports Scene, the rise and fall of Georgetown basketball. Greg Bicouvaris along with Paul Fuqua and Dino here. Of course, we mentioned all the lineage and the trees, and our final segment right here before we close out this show is that Thompson, Esherick, JT3, Patrick Ewing, all part of that Thompson tree. They're eventually going to make a coaching change, and it's going to be like starting all over again. Now, question to you as an alum, should they stay in that tree and circle, or should they branch out of the tree?
I think they should try and hire the best coach they can. If this is an if there is a move and the school has to say goodbye to Patrick Ewing for one reason or another, they should look for the best coach, not a name, but someone who can make excellent decisions for the basketball program. They may look, for instance, at Steve Turner, the head coach at Gonzaga High School. He has some college experience, but he knows how to coach, and he knows how to recruit, and he knows the DMV area, and he's been successful despite the academic credentials that are required to attend that particular high school. You don't know. You just don't know.
You don't know how it's going to work out, exactly. I mean, you look at North Carolina, they pretty much stayed in that tree after Dean Smith, and of course Hubert Davis played for Dean Smith, and one of the things he wanted to do was get all former Carolina players as assistants. So it's kind of hard to break that mold. Syracuse, like I mentioned, the same thing. And of course, who's going to replace Boeheim eventually? It's going to happen one of these days. Paul, thank you for your time, your talent, and your treasure on enlightening us about your alumni at Georgetown, and all the best to you and your family.
Thank you very much.
Very good. Also, all right, folks, that is Sports Scene. Again, you can go to our YouTube page. The show will be on YouTube on Greg Bick, GregBic. For more, go to gjbtv.com, as this is a specialty show on the rise and fall of Georgetown basketball. Regardless, they played a rich history in college basketball, especially in the era of TV and the Big East as well. When you thought of the Big East in the 80s, you thought of Syracuse, Georgetown, Villanova, St. John's, Providence. Rick Pitino coached at Providence. This was just a great era. Just like in this area where we grew up with Dean Smith and Bill Foster, both Bill Fosters, the one at Duke and Clemson, Terry Holland, and so many great coaches, Norm Sloan, Jimmy Valvano. So the ACC and the Big East now have kind of intertwined with so many schools that were once in the Big East, like Syracuse and Miami, are now in the ACC. So, again, for Paul Fuqua and Dino Franza, I'm Greg Bicouvaris. Thanks for listening to Sports Scene, and we'll talk to you soon.